Welcome to the chapel of Robinson College here at the University of Cambridge. Today we're delighted to welcome Amitav Ghosh, who shares his notion of stories, of the language they employ, and the new worlds they invite us to inhabit. Amitav Ghosh is an award-winning writer, author of multiple novels, the most recent of which is Gun Island, which we discuss today. We begin our conversation with a reading from Scripture in which Jesus discusses the nature of parables. A parable, after all, is a micro-narrative, an ideological explosive device that breaks down old worlds and invites us to inhabit a new world.
Again he began to teach beside the lake. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the lake and sat there, while the whole crowd was beside the lake on the land. He began to teach them many things in parables, and in his teaching he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, 'Let anyone with ears to hear listen.' When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, 'To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look, but not perceive, and may indeed listen, but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven.'"
Amitav Ghosh, a very warm welcome to Robinson College Chapel.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure. I remember Robinson College well.
You do?
I've often walked past it, yes.
Oh, really? I didn't realise you'd been in Cambridge. I know you studied a PhD in Oxford, is that right?
Yes, but in the years since, I've actually spent more time at Cambridge, much more time at Cambridge than Oxford, even though I'm an honorary fellow at Wolfson College at Oxford. But I wrote a book called In an Antique Land, which is about a Jewish trader in the 12th century who goes to live in India. So for that, I did most of the research at the UCL. You know, they have a collection of Geniza documents, the Taylor Schechter collection. So it's a collection, you know, with the Maimonides letters and so on.
Ah, yes.
Yes, a lot of it is in a language called Judeo-Arabic. So it's very interesting. Yes, they have the best collection in the world. So,
but you're quite a linguist, aren't you? I mean, it seems in Gun Island there's lots of multilinguistic conjunction that seems to open up new worlds.
You know, if you grow up in India, you can't help being multilingual because, you know, we speak one language at home, another language in school, another language on the streets. So it's just, you know, it's a part of that. I wouldn't say languages come easily to me, but I enjoy languages, you know. Right. I enjoy learning languages. I enjoy dealing with them, yeah.
Can I ask you the big meta question to begin with? Just what are you doing when you tell a story? What is the human and perhaps transhuman thing called narrative?
It's so interesting that you asked that, you know, because, you know, have you ever read a novelist called Graham Swift? He's an English novelist.
I've heard of Graham Swift.
He wrote a wonderful book called Waterland. And in Waterland, there's a character who says, I don't know if this is Graham Swift's opinion or not, but he says that storytelling is the ultimate sort of human, you know, it's a province of the human, as it were, you know. It's something that humans do. And it sounds very plausible since we humans have language and most other species, as far as we know, don't. But it's becoming increasingly clear now. There's been a lot of studies that show that actually many other species, including animals and so on, actually understand the world through forms of storying. I mean, especially if you take migrations. Think of all those whales, traveling thousands of miles every year, coming back to the same places. And every year, some species of whales actually change their songs. How do we know they don't have stories about where they're going? you know?
It's interesting. I approached you largely because I've done some work with Louise Wessling in the US and Patricia Austin in Poland, who in different ways are looking at the animal world, looking at the plant world, and unpacking the possibility of communication and narrative inherent to those things.
We know now that forests have very extensive systems of communication. And if they do have that, and we know that they actually have an awareness of history, of the past. So how can we say that they don't have forms of storytelling? In that sense, I think I mean, contra Graham Swift's character, that in fact the faculty of storytelling is actually a faculty of life itself, wherever it manifests itself.
I suppose the context in which we're reading stories now, the context in which you're writing even, I think this surfaces in your latest novel. It feels like an era of, rugged individualism, identity politics, where lots of us would rather tolerate people than listen to them. It feels like our human stories are mutually isolated. And one of the striking aspects of Gun Island seems to be how these seemingly different and disparate stories converge and spill over into one another. And I wonder, is it that convergence that actually that opens up a new world? Is it that convergence, that sort of hardcore storytelling that repositions the reader, to your mind?
Just to go back to the beginning of your question, you're talking about identity politics and rugged individualism and so on. You have to remember that those things are very much bound to certain moments in history. It's a part of a specifically sort of Anglo-Saxon ideology, you might call it. Yeah. And we are really seeing today, I think, all around the world, but most of all in America and in England, this ideology having reached its extreme limits. But that is not the ideology of even all Europeans, far less Asians or Indians or Chinese or whatever. So we have to be aware of the historically limited nature of of that way of conceiving of things. And of course, Anglicanism played a very fundamental role in the emergence of this ideology. That's also something that one can't be unaware of.
It's true. I have to confess, I'm not an Anglican. I think I'm the only chaplain in Cambridge that's not, so I don't understand it as well as most.
Well, what's your denomination?
I'm an Anabaptist.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah, it's. I suppose the Anabaptists identify their history as perhaps being the underbelly of history, where the outside voice is the one that's always going to be interesting. But yeah, it means that you then inherit an alternative narrative, a different narrative to the mainstream one, even in a place like Cambridge. But having said that, I think denominational differences now in Britain seem to have been swallowed up by a wider set of ideological assumptions about how the world works. Religion, in that sense of institutionalized religion, feels like an older ideological tool, and it feels like there's something else in place now. But again, this is something that seems to be part of the backstory of your writing. It's conscious that it feels like there is some kind of a hurdle for your characters to overcome. In particular, maybe it's the convergence of capitalism and the ecological climate that we face. Are you able to say a little more about that, about how those things shape our self-understanding?
Well, let me say, first of all, that it's very interesting to know that you're an Anabaptist, because I think that, actually all these heterodox Christian cults, or, streams, if you like, that's a much better word, these streams of heterodox Christianity are actually traceable back to Zoroastrianism. I think it's the great Zoroastrian substrate of world history, which is never recognized, and but which finds ways of renewing itself again and again. But see, my interest in all these things, climate change, narrative, and so on, has really come together in an interest in vitalism. Humans are not the only ensouled beings. That the world is full of many different kinds of beings, many unseen beings, and many malign beings, many good beings as well, but also that the whole sort of spectrum of natural, what we might call animal beings, and so on and so forth, which is actually the way that most humans have always understood the world until you have the suppression, if you like, of these other ways of seeing things.
I was going to say the Polish scholar I mentioned uses the phrase "un-Cartesian enlightenment," which seems to express something of what's happening in your book, where these dualisms, in particular the mind-body dualism,
exactly,
feels like it was never legitimate in the first place.
It's an absolutely crazy idea. I mean, that's the really weird thing. How did people come to believe that animals are robots or machines? I mean, really, anyone who spent 5 minutes with an animal knows that it's not a robot.
Yeah. Or that human beings think only with their brains.
Yes. Yes, absolutely, because we now know, and I mean, I feel it all the time, that in fact, what my grandmother told me is true, which is that most of your thinking is done by your tummy, and all the sort of bacteria that live in your tummy.
That's a very Hebrew view of the world, it feels like. Can I ask you then, you're talking about vitalism and about the different types of beings that inhabit the earth and perhaps inhabit us. Demon possession seems to be a key theme of Gun Island, and I think even of the marine biologist character, who is a hardcore expression of sort of traditional modernist scientific worldview. You use the imagery towards the end of the book of her emotional door being slightly ajar. It seems to suggest that even there, even given the rigidity of her worldview, there is scope to encounter some form of possession. Christianity tends to regard demon possession as a very negative thing, but I wonder, we've been talking about individualism, whether a healthier view of humanity might be this a mutual indwelling of spirits. It's seen as something healthy, and I've got this sense in your novel as well that there feels like something very positive going on by this sense of possession by the other. Could you say a little more about that? Was this something conscious, or?
Your first question, the first part of your question, let me talk about that first in relation to the scientist in my book. I think many scientists who work closely with non-humans are actually much broader in their understanding of the world than they're willing to put down on paper for fear of ridicule. But Jane Goodall, for example, has been very outspoken about recognizing many vitalist qualities in animals, many human qualities in chimpanzees, in gorillas, and so on. And she's talked about this repeatedly, and she talks about how science limits your vision, how science limits your understanding of the world. I myself have worked quite closely with a marine biologist, and I've seen the ways in which, especially a lot of the techniques of marine biology and so on are just how should I say, very reductionist kinds of empiricism, and they don't allow themselves to think of certain things, even when they know that those things are present, when they know that the animal recognizes them and responds to them, they just don't allow that idea to enter their own heads. So I think there is a kind of willed blindness there. And I think that willed blindness enters many other parts of our lives. Let me just say this. I think it's very interesting that in the last few years, there have been many articles about this. But apparently, within the Catholic Church in America, there are more and more exorcisms all the time. There's been a steady increase in exorcisms in the Roman Catholic Church in the U.S. The Pope Francis, who to my mind is the most rational man in the world today, the most sensible, the most rational person around, much more so than any scientist or a politician. He has said quite explicitly that he thinks demonic possession is real. He thinks demons are real. They're out there in the world. And I think if someone like that says that, you have to take them seriously. Look, today, I think, we have to think back when we're trying to locate our particular period. We've had this incredible breakthrough in communications technologies, over the last 10 or 15 years. In a way, it's like the Gutenberg Revolution. And what followed in the wake of the Gutenberg Revolution? Many things, Protestantism and so on, of course, but also the great witchcraft scares, the great witchcraft hysteria that possessed the West, through the 16th and 17th centuries. And I think we're beginning to see something similar occurring in the world today. I mean, just look at the profound disruption that's occurred. I mean, if you look at these far-right people in America, QAnon and so on, so many of their memes and so many of their conspiracy theories are actually completely directly borrowed from the witchcraft hysteria of the 17th, 16th and 17th centuries.
Interesting.
It's something which is happening around us. And we, unfortunately, are choosing not to recognize this. And it seems so unlikely because it's happening through this sort of very technological medium. But there you are. It's all around us.
It feels sometimes as though technology and at least some of the social media platforms are designed to keep us separate from one another, and designed almost to keep our stories mutually isolated.
I think this technology has had a sort of profoundly disruptive effect, on people's lives, on human interconnections. And, I don't think people discuss this enough in relation, especially to, say, these huge migratory movements that we are seeing. When I spoke with these young men who've been crossing the Mediterranean at incredible risk to themselves, in many instances, you really have the sense that actually they've ceded their agency to their phones, So in a sense, it is a kind of possession. It is a kind of medium of possession. I mean, these huge migrations would not be possible without this technology. I mean, every element of this movement is made possible by the cell phone technologies. They pay their traffickers with them. They find the ways in which to go. I mean, it's absolutely tied into these networks of technology, and it amazes me that people don't seem to recognize this.
That was one of the most disturbing elements of the book, actually, was hearing the stories of these young men, which are just utterly heartbreaking. Even though I realize it's fiction, clearly these are true stories at some level. These are the stories that are happening today that we just don't get to hear.
You're absolutely right, Simon. And I think the reason that you don't get to hear them is that the journalists who talk to the migrants are all Westerners who don't know their languages. So, before writing Gun Island, I spent a long time in Italy visiting, all their many of their migrant facilities, and speaking to people. And, simply because of my background, I speak a lot of the languages that are spoken by these migrants, Bengali, Urdu, um, Arabic, and so on. And it was very interesting. I think if you speak to migrants in their own languages, you get a very different picture from what is presented to you by the Western press. Uh, the Western press is just interested, in a sense, in the politics of it. I mean, on the one hand, you have the right wingers saying migration is terrible. On the other hand, you have the left wingers saying no or the liberals, you might say, that migration is important. Uh, I completely agree, if you like, with the liberal position. But what interests me is to see, what is behind it. How does it happen? What's behind it? And those are the questions that I think Western journalists don't ask often enough. And simply, because they're limited by the lack of languages.
That surfaces even in the story, though, because it's the languages, the linguistic ability that is necessary in order to give voice to these boys. And when you do it, it exposes us to the sheer vulnerability of these people that would scare us if we saw them in the street. But the narrative confronts us above all with the sheer vulnerability and an overwhelming desire to do something.
Simon, I know that that's how we like to think of it.
Of course.
That the incredible risk and so on. But if you think about it, for young men, and these are, overwhelmingly young men between, let's say, 16 and 17 and 25. If you think of yourself at that age, risk is not a deterrent. Risk is an incentive. You feel excited about risk. I mean, after all, why do people go off and climb mountains or go into the jungles or, do all those things? I mean, it's because they find risk exciting. And, it's a part of the dehumanization of these, of the ways in which we look at these young men that we don't recognize, that they also have these, they have agency, they have desires, they feel a certain excitement about the world. I remember when I was 19, 20, I made a lot of very, very risky and dangerous journeys, and so do some people.
What we would understand as a compassionate response is itself an imposition, a dehumanization of who these people really are and who they really might be.
That is absolutely right. In Italy, so often, I would see, because, older Italians, they always have a migrant pushing their wheelchair or something. And I would sometimes listen in on these conversations. And the older Italian would be telling his badante, his caregiver, about some journey he'd made in the Amazon, having flown there and so on and so forth. And the guy would be listening carefully, and I used to burst into laughter, thinking, do you know what this guy has probably been through? Crossing the Sahara, crossing the Mediterranean.
It's unthinkable, isn't it? I suppose even in the book, the main character is not Mr. Fix-It. He refrains from trying to make everything right. There's a sensitivity to this guy that causes him to tread lightly.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to approach these issues simply in terms of solutions, sort of impoverishes the world that we're in a way.
And so perhaps narrative then is the most effective means of repositioning ourselves in relation to people we don't understand.
I wouldn't say that in a prescriptive sense. I mean, everyone has their own ways of understanding what they're around. But it's certainly the only way that I have. And I think the great thing about narrative, is that narrative is founded for me on empathy. And that faculty of empathy is something, again, that humans share with animals and many other kinds of beings. And so I think essentially narrative arises out of empathy, and it allows us to open these windows into these other worlds.
That sounds like a magnificent place to finish. Amitav Ghosh, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Great.